Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Welcome. Did you know there was a speaker tonight? I bet you did. Welcome. Feel free. We purposely start the speaking portion of the evening a little bit earlier just to be mindful of everyone's schedule. But feel free to finish up. We don't expect you to be all done. Chris would love for you to, when you finish, put your plates over there on that rack so he can get started with dishes. But feel free to finish your meal as we get started. I'm just going to open with a short introduction, and then we're sitting here like this because it's going to be a little different today. Instead of a pure talk and then questions, it's going to be a little bit of a dialogue. So I hope you enjoy, and there will be opportunity throughout towards the end of the talk for you to, bring your own questions in. So this is the second Thursday night out of the season. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nicholas Cassis. I'm an associate rector here at Trinity-by-the-Cove. And I'd like to thank Alex Vance, Rusty Troth, and Bruce McKever, who are on the committee that organizes this speaker series event. Just a couple quick reminders before we get started. A couple of people have asked if this talk will be recorded, and it will. It's being live streamed right now and also recorded. So if you want to return to it at a later time, or if you think it would be helpful to pass on to someone else, or you want to review it or share it with someone, a friend, you can do that on our website under Formation and then Speaker Series. I already mentioned the format's a little bit different, so if as we go through this dialogue, if questions occur to you, or if you already have a question in mind because you know the topic of conversation, feel free to jot those down on your placemat or just make a mental note. And then as I'll leave plenty of time at the end. I was going to leave no time at the end for questions just because I figured, there's nothing contentious or difficult going on in the world around us, so you probably don't have any questions. But I figured I'll leave at least a few minutes at the end. There are also books for sale. When I introduce John in a second, I'll tell you some of the wonderful books that he's authored, one of which is his latest, Learning to Disagree. So we have some copies on the table back there, which you're welcome to walk out today with. As long as you add a little donation on that table, that would be wonderful. So tonight, we are honored to be joined in person by Dr. John Inazu. We Zoomed John in about 3 years ago for another talk, but this is his first in-person visit to Trinity. John is the Sally D. Danforth Distinguished Professor of Law and Religion at Washington University in St. Louis. His latest book, I already mentioned, is Learning to Disagree, The Surprising Path to Navigating Differences with Empathy and Respect. He is also the author of Liberty's Refuge, The Forgotten Freedom of Assembly, and also Confident Pluralism, Surviving and Thriving Deep Difference, and co-editor with Tim Keller of Uncommon Ground, Living Faithfully in a World of Difference. Dr. Inazu is the founder of the Carver Project and the Legal Vocation Fellowship, and a senior fellow at Interfaith America, and also the Trinity Forum. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Engineering degree and a JD from Duke University, and a PhD in Political Science from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Seems like a little bit of a rivalry there. Okay. Our conversation tonight will cover stories and ideas of disagreement inside and outside of the church, and how Christians can be leading the way of faithful and neighborly witness in a world of fracture and polarization. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. John Inazu?
Can I just say it's great to be with you in person, although I will say when we Zoomed 3 years ago, Nicholas poised the camera so I could see the beautiful sunny weather and said, this is what you could see if you were here.
Yeah, we can do our own little bait and switch here, right? No, I promised him this is not typical January Naples weather, but I guess we'll just have to do this another time so that I can prove myself true. Since there's going to be plenty of time for opportunities, I think the questions that you'll ask are going to be specific questions that are focused on your own individual lives and things that are going on in the world. What I thought I'd do is start by engaging with John in terms of the content of the book, more general questions about some of the themes and ideas in the book, and that way we can, for those of you who, many of you have read the book, if you haven't read it already, it'll sort of bring you up to speed, and then we can engage a little bit more deeply. So why don't you begin by just telling us a little bit about yourself and what led you to write this book?
Yeah, sure. So again, it's great to be here with all of you. I'm sort of an accidental law professor. I never intended to do this. I majored in engineering in college. I was there on an ROTC scholarship and quickly discovered that I was very bad at engineering. And I went to law school as an escape hatch from engineering. I never talked to a lawyer, didn't know anything about the law, just knew it was not engineering, and then had some detours in law school and found myself in legal practice. And at that point, it all started to click a bit, and I really liked the practice of law, which led me eventually, with a bunch of breaks along the way, to law teaching. And now I really get to do exactly what I love to do. And my core, you mentioned earlier work, my core work is on the First Amendment's right of assembly. And so when you think about assembly in the First Amendment and what it represents for our polity and our people, the idea that we come together in groups, Madison called them factions, they weren't always a good thing. That's how we live in society, and our groups are different, and we form our beliefs and cultures within those groups, and it's important to respect different kinds of formation and different kinds of groups. That's the 30-second constitutional and historical overview, and then you can see maybe how that then leads to questions of pluralism, questions of deep difference. How do we figure out our society today that feels so fractured, which is a lot of where my current writing has gone. But I'll say that this book in particular has been an interesting convergence of my professional work for the last 15, 20 years with my personal life, and I think I only discovered this as I got into the writing process, but I'm somebody, you mentioned Duke UNC, which is already a bit of a tension and a difference, but I'm also a Japanese American who's navigated our country as not entirely a white person. I'm someone who served at the Pentagon but was influenced by a pacifist theologian. I'm a Christian who works at a non-Christian university where I'm sometimes distrusted in the university and sometimes distrusted in my church. And so I get all of these tension points of kind of living out this difference. And then I suppose now, being married with 3 kids, we have our own difference at home too sometimes. And so the fun part of this book, which is a narrative-based story account that integrates some examples from my own life and teaching, is that it allowed me to bring together the professional and the personal in ways that I think will connect more than an abstract academic treatise.
Mm-hmm. Great, that's awesome. You're not supposed to judge a book by its cover, but I will judge 2 things. One, the title and the subtitle. The title, Learning to Disagree, it seems like we're pretty good at just disagreeing already. In what sense do we need to learn?
Yeah. So think of the words learning to disagree as a deliberate contrast to that phrase you sometimes hear, agree to disagree. Usually when I hear we're going to agree to disagree, it's sort of passive-aggressive code for we can't talk about this, right? Or I don't have time for that. And what I want to suggest in this title is there's a better way toward disagreement, which is not actually consensus. In most cases, across most hard issues, you're not going to persuade the person across the table that they're wrong and you're right. But you can figure out, maybe with a little more empathy, a little more understanding, why you might not think they're right, but they're not stupid and they're not evil and they're not uninformed, and there might just be a different way that they're seeing this issue. And then the last thing I'll say about the title is learning is meant to suggest this ongoing, never-ending activity that we are never done doing. So none of us is going to figure this out. We're going to keep trying. We're going to screw up along the way. We need to ask each other for forgiveness and hopefully get a little better over time. But we're not going to have learned to disagree in this lifetime.
That's super helpful, and I'll come back to that idea of how long this process is going to take in just a second, but I don't want to pass by the subtitle as well. The surprising path to navigating differences with empathy and respect. Why that choice of surprising? What's surprising about this?
Yeah, mostly because my editor told me to, but no, I think a couple of reasons there. So for those of you who have seen the book or know a bit about it, the pitch I'm really trying to make is to persuade those of you who think that lawyers are part of the problem to persuade you that we're actually part of the solution in some measured and important ways, and that there's something about what law can show us, that it can help us in everyday conversations and relationships. So in that way, it's surprising. But then I think also surprising in the sense that this is not rocket science. as you go through the stories and the ideas that I'm talking about, in some ways, it's almost common sense, and yet it's extremely difficult to put into practice. And it's the stuff that challenges us more internally. It's not like we have to wrap our heads around the difficulty of disagreement, but we have to figure out relationally and on a human level, how can I understand this person who seems so different, so wrong, so annoying, so misguided. And then this is not a Christian book, it's written for a broad audience, but I think Christians especially have a lot to participate and to contribute to when we start with the premise that the other people around us are image bearers, when we have the resources of the fruits of the Spirit and other motivators from our own faith, and we ought to be out there leading the way in some of this.
That's also really helpful. So back to the idea of how long this is going to take. I suspect you probably get a lot of people who say, "Give me the first 3-step process and how I'm going to do this. What's the first couple things I need to do?" I suspect that from reading the book, the concepts that you're talking about, while in one sense simple, are not quick fixes, but they're habits and practices for those who are kind of in it for the long haul. So if you use maybe empathy as an example, how do we learn to be more empathetic? What does that process look like?
Yeah, I think the word you said, practice, is so important. You have to do this in real time with real people. I think one of the reasons, and many of us, either if we're willing to admit it in our own lives or in people we know, we've really messed this up, especially online. Because we're not actually practicing empathy. We're practicing almost the opposite. We're reducing people to sound bites and two-dimensional caricatures. And when just think about how you feel online when you think, I've got to hit that reply, or I've got to forward this with vigor. I think one of the subtexts for Christians here is God does not need you as his spokesperson for every issue that you encounter on social media. So you can just let most of it pass, just say a prayer and move on to the next thing. And the reason that's important is that is formation. And every time you're hitting the button or hitting the reply, you are forming yourself in a particular direction that is, in most cases online, not your best when it comes to empathy and understanding. So then the question is, how do you practice this in real life and in offline context, and how do you do it? How do you build trust over time? And there's no way to hurry this up. I think this is sort of an example that some of you will recognize when especially at elite schools, when we had the protests last spring over Israel-Gaza, I saw a lot of university presidents stand up and say, our community is better than this, our community needs to come together, and nobody believed them because there had not been any work prior to that about building a community of trust. And the time to talk about community is not the moment of crisis. The time to talk about trust building and relationship building is not when you're on the precipice of a national election or when you're about to have that argument at Thanksgiving dinner. It has to be way before then, when you're in the ordinary course of life and you're saying, you know what? It turns out that we both made it to coffee on Wednesday, and we learned a little something about our lives, and we discovered some common interests, and then way down the road over time, when you hit that crisis moment or that really deep disagreement, there's enough capital in the bank to let you take some risks. And I think many of us misjudge how much is there, and we think that, surely we can have this conversation, but we haven't actually done the investment and the work and the relationship to set that up for success.
Yeah, so what you're describing is something that is made up of small everyday choices and activities and practices that build up into habits and form character. And so obviously we know that's not a quick process in any sphere. You mentioned how the book is not a Christian book. It's not written for a Christian audience per se, and you hope anyone who picks up the book would be able to get a lot out of it. However, and some of the concepts and ideas that are drawn directly from your experience in law school at a secular university. However, the concepts are also, if I'm reading it correctly, deeply Christian. So those who are who don't share our same faith commitments, does this pose a problem for that larger project if those who don't share that faith would rather win arguments than understand?
Yeah, so I think, and the way I've tried to approach this book in particular is, I think most of the concepts and ideas, although Christians have unique theological resources and reservoirs to draw from, I think you see this in many different faith traditions and many, I mean, empathy, for example, right? You don't, and you can learn empathy from your neighborhood association. There's nothing distinctively Christian about that. There are a couple of exceptions. I've got a later chapter on forgiveness. I do think forgiveness is at least in a thick sense requires some sort of transcendent commitment because it's related to the alternative to worldly justice, which is always imperfect. And so to have the resources to talk about something other than worldly justice, forgiveness might require transcendent faith, and I think Christian faith in particular gives you some very deep resources and commands about forgiveness. Mm-hmm. So that might be one that is sort of a tricky issue to think through, but ideally most of these would be accessible to broad populations.
Okay, that makes sense. You also mentioned, in a lighthearted way, Thanksgiving Day conversations. We've all experienced conversations that are heated, are difficult. We recognize also that we, as you alluded to before, are unlikely to persuade people in one conversation or even over several conversations. There's also the risk of hurting people's feelings, of damaging relationships, and yet one of the concepts in the book is to be willing to have and encouraging us to have those difficult conversations. Why not just avoid difficult conversations?
Yeah, so sometimes you should. Sometimes the answer is just avoid. And and the reason that there's a serious point to that, underlying that quip, is that I think part of recognizing our own finitude is knowing we cannot possibly be in relationship with everyone we'd like to know well or make peace with. We can't possibly engage in every argument because we're limited human beings with only so much capacity. And so we have to discern and prioritize certain relationships and then pursue those well. And the kind of trust building and vulnerability, you can't just generalize. So I think slowing down and discerning first is one step in that direction.
Okay, that's great. And another way that you answered that question in your book was through the poignant story of when your father was dying of lung cancer, and a rift in your relationship was healed through a difficult conversation. This seems to point to the fact that as serious as our disagreements are, as those beliefs that we hold are serious to us, relationships are more important. And sometimes the only way to heal relationships is to be willing to have those difficult conversations. You already kind of touched on this, but how do you decide when it's important enough to have those conversations and when it might be best to take a pass?
Yeah, and I mean, again, this is going to be so sort of individualized for people because you can probably, or you can imagine certain relationships that are just too fraught right now, or they're too emotionally hard, so it's not the right moment to pursue them. But at some point, with a lot of our close relationships, you do have to take some risks. I mean, in my case with my dad, it was just the mutual recognition that we were running out of time, that there was, this was not going to be an indefinite opportunity to reconcile. And then in the midst of if you do sort of step forward and take the risk, don't try to do this in a way, I would say set modest goals and break the problem into smaller, more accessible chunks. So if your rift is you can't understand why your relative or your friend voted for that person in the election, don't have a discussion about why you voted for the president in that way. That's such a complicated and loaded question. Unpack it, and maybe you figure out, and it would not be hard to find, if you voted differently than someone and that's leading to a rift in your relationship, it won't be hard to find lots of other sub-issues related to that. So pick an issue, immigration, or I'll just make one up. Let's say it's immigration, and then say, because we trust each other, because we've had all those coffees, or we've had a few good Thanksgivings, let's commit to coming together, and we're both going to share an article that we found influential to the position that we hold on the issue of immigration. Not 30 pages, but 1,200 words. And we're going to commit to reading both articles with a kind of open charity and trying to figure out why these arguments matter to each person. And then maybe the next meeting is, I'm just going to hear from you, and I'm not going to give you my counterpoints. I'm just going to ask questions, and we'll flip it. And so 4 meetings to discuss why you differ on immigration is a practical step toward trust building in a fraught relationship that is far likelier to bear fruit than why did you vote for that person.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Another issue that you raise is the sort of undeniable truth that we all place our trust in some sort of faith, whether it's faith in God, faith in science, our own capacities, faith in reason. And even though these are often unargued assumptions that we just bring to arguments rather than argue about, and some might see these as weaknesses, I think you see them in some ways as an asset. How does the fact that we have these fundamental assumptions help us recognize something about our shared humanity and shared limitations?
Yeah, I think it's, so on the faith piece, there are a couple of intellectual moves going on here. I think one is trying to level the playing field and just remind readers and the rest of us that we are all relying on faith in something. I mean, I got on an airplane to come here, and I studied a little bit of aerodynamics when I was in college, but I certainly can't tell you why it worked. And I put a lot of faith in the people building and maintaining and flying that piece of machinery to get me here. And we have faith in all sorts of complicated processes that we're part of, and we can't not have anything but faith in how we commit and order our lives, whether it's to God or the absence of God or something else. So we're all trusting in things unseen to us, and that's actually a nice sort of common ground of the human condition to recognize. But I think for a lot of Christians, part of the move toward that common ground is maybe being okay with a little uncertainty in what faith brings. I think I've been thinking a lot about doubt and and the importance of doubt to strengthening faith. I mean, when the man comes to Jesus and he says, "I do believe, but help my unbelief," that there's God can handle some doubt and some questioning. And I think at least when I was growing up as a Christian in high school and college, there was so much focus on certainty and propositions. And this is not an argument for relativism that just says whatever you want to believe, but it is to say that maybe rather than foregrounding certainty, we can talk about something like confidence. This is what the theologian Leslie Newbegin would say, confidence in the person of Jesus, which then helps us order our lives without being so propositional about it all, and being okay with taking doubt to prayer rather than just pretending like you never have doubts or uncertainties. And then if you actually can do that in a faith context, that will also help you in an argument or a disagreement context, because you can be a little less rigid about some of your own starting points. I mean, I'll often go into a conversation and say, here's what I believe it, I've done a lot of reading about this, I think I'm right, but maybe I'm wrong. So, tell me your argument. I want to learn from you. And I think just even showing another human being that you take them seriously and that you want to respect what they have to say rather than just preach to them, I think that opens up the possibility of a conversation.
Awesome. And that's also, I think, a way that you can bridge something like a characteristically human, Christian virtue like humility to a broader audience. I want to talk a little bit about a comment you made earlier about the line between wrong and evil. In the book, you use the example of Joe, a conservative law student whose views are quickly silenced and characterized as evil, which is an odd impulse when you stop and think of it. What do you think motivates that impulse to move from "I believe your views are wrong" to "I believe you are evil"?
Yeah, what you've just described, I think, is a huge and growing concern in our country today, because once you make that step, it's incredibly difficult to think of how to walk it back. I mean, when you think someone is wrong and even misguided and maybe their views are hurting society, you can still say, let's have lunch and talk about it. Or maybe we can work together at the soup kitchen. But if you really think someone's evil, you're not going to do any of that. You're going to want to minimize their influence in the world and your time with them. And the challenge here is to not surrender to an anything goes mentality. There is evil in the world. You don't have to sit down with a neo-Nazi and say, let me learn more about your beliefs, right? So it's okay to draw some lines and say that is an evil set of beliefs that I'm not going to play around with. But a lot of us in our own personal and social circles have started to lump a whole lot of other people into that evil category. You didn't vote the way I did, and so you're evil, right? Or you think this particular way about some theological doctrine, and so you're evil. And we use these labels and we put people in these boxes that then really minimize the possibility of an ongoing human relationship. And so I think it's, I mean, and the related point here is you can still pronounce judgment on beliefs that are misguided or even beliefs that are evil, but you can separate usually the beliefs from the people who hold them and say, you are a human being. You're created in the image of God. We are both imperfect. I think your views and your approaches to the world are wrong and harmful and misguided, and I'm not ever going to, I hope you lose at the polls. I hope your person doesn't win, but I can treat you as a fellow human being.
Thank you. I think that's both important and very helpful. I noticed that in many things, you need two to tango. Both parties in a conversation need to be willing to make this kind of project work, or at least in some, to some degree. You mentioned the example of two people who can commit to taking that first step of sharing an article, and but that takes two people willing to engage. What do we do when only one party is willing to play?
Yeah, so I think this is another area where I think Christians have some distinctive resources. And in my own work, and some earlier work, I focused on the idea of tolerance, and I think tolerance is a really important and useful concept. But from a Christian perspective, tolerance is kind of the threshold, the low bar. I mean, to be tolerant, we're not called to be tolerant as Christians. We're called to love who? Our neighbors, our enemies, all the people who annoy us. We're called to forgive people over and over again. So I think the move from tolerance to a kind of empathy and even a generous love from Christians means for us, we don't really have the option not to try. I mean, again, there are going to be some exceptions if you're in a emotionally abusive situation, you just need to get out for a while. That makes sense. But in many cases, even if there's a lack of reciprocity, you don't have a get out of jail free card or a pass. You got to keep hanging in there. And sometimes that means taking some hits. And I think about if you know or if you anticipate a conversation where you for just based on past experience, you think this person is not going to respond kindly, then just choose to go into that conversation with anticipation of what's to come. Make sure you're coming in with a full tank. You're well rested. You've prayed about it. You've had a good meal. And you were going to get on this hard issue, and you are probably going to say some things that I find absolutely offensive and that annoy me and that I think are really shrill or unthoughtful. And instead of just calling you out in the moment or responding angrily because I've pre-gamed this and because I know this is going to happen, I'm going to respond calmly. I'm going to ask a follow-up question, right? I'm going to treat you kindly in the moment. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to have the best conversation ever, but it certainly increases the odds that it's going to go better than the alternative of you shouting in response. So when you anticipate that lack of reciprocity, then just dig deeper for your own resources.
Yeah. Something about setting the tone and expectations, but also the tone of your address when you engage with someone. The way that you actually open the book I thought was very interesting. So I didn't really comment on the structure of the book, but it's over the course of an academic year in law school. Each month you kind of address a particular issue and you engage with things going on in the classroom, but also things in your own life outside of the classroom. The book opens with an anecdote about Monday morning routine, coffee on the porch, and you get sucked into a social media thread on your phone. There's a lot of sort of vulnerability in the book. I mean, that's a silly thing. We've all been in that same situation. But it raises the question of, where we choose to place our attention, where we choose to focus our attention, but also just the question of technology more generally. How do smartphones and social media complicate this discussion?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, but I think just as a first point, just know that you are being formed, you and I are being formed by the practices that we engage in online. And the whole thing is not set up to form us well. I mean, there are amazing benefits to being connected online, and you can keep up with, I mean, I'm thinking of my oldest kid is about to go off to college, and just the fact that we're able to text now and Zoom is going to, that wasn't available when I was in college, and I'm excited, to just text her randomly during the day. Maybe she's not excited, but she's gonna get those texts. So there are great upsides to technology, but just especially when it gets to these contested issues that we're not forming our best selves when we're in those areas. And then this is massively complicated by two urgent and growing problems. One is the collapse of traditional media institutions. And this is, I think we all know this is bad, but I'm going to say it's even worse than we think. That our best and most trusted, your mileage will vary in what you think is trusted, but the legacy institutions, the ones that care about good editors, that have budgets for reviews and those sorts of things, they're going away. And editorial staffs are being cut. And even my friends who write at even some of the biggest name places are essentially freelancers right now. They've turned the best journalists and columnists into freelancers who are competing for a few minutes online before the next news cycle. That's not good for how we get our information, and we can all add to that with other examples of the structural changes, then overlay that with the AI stuff that's already here and going to get worse. So if you think that there's going to be an online path forward for understanding difference, for getting to know about the world and keeping up with the news, I think it's just going to get a lot worse. So that means, what are the alternatives? How can you be thinking about those alternatives now? And how can you form your own practices to prioritize the alternatives? And because I think we're just on the very front edge of AI, and it's going to exacerbate all of these problems in ways we can't even foresee.
Mm-hmm. Well, you paint a very rosy picture about the future, and I think it actually ties in with the concept of forgiveness, which you talked about earlier. You mentioned in the book at one point that the very idea of forgiveness has become offensive to many people in our society, which is a scary thought on both the individual level and also on the societal level. You tell the story of one of your students, Jennifer, you call her, who's engaged in an independent study and writing on Augustine, and very unfavorably writing on Augustine. And you describe how your initial judgment that this paper would end up being a diatribe, that she was just unteachable, she would not listen to any correction or receive feedback, was actually, at the end of the day, unfortunately, wrong. In other words, she was eventually teachable, she did eventually turn around. Why do you think the concept of forgiveness, of being willing to admit we're wrong, has become so offensive to many? And does the church have a responsibility, maybe a unique responsibility, to show the world that there is a better way to deal with failings and limitations?
Yeah, I've thought sort of intellectually and theologically about forgiveness for a while, and some other work I've done. And the more I spend time thinking about the concept, both interpersonally and as a society, it's very hard to think about what the plausible alternative is. We know for a fact we're going to keep hurting each other, we're going to experience injustice, and we're going to cause injustice. And we can either get absorbed into these cycles of mutual vengeance, which are never going to satisfy, or we can look to models and exemplars of forgiveness for a different way forward. And forgiveness does not mean a lack of accountability or punishment. Both can go together, but forgiveness does allow you to move forward in a world that's going to be otherwise very hard to manage, just on a human level, let alone as a Christian. I'll give you one sort of silly and somewhat embarrassing example that I think illustrates the point, which is not in the book, but I was a few months ago in the Austin airport, and I was dressed in a suit, carrying my bags, walking very quickly because I was late for my flight, and there was a single blueberry that someone had dropped from a smoothie or something that was in the middle of the floor of the airport, and I stepped right on the blueberry and went sprawling. So this one blueberry just took me out, and I've got all my bags. I'm flying on the floor, and I look up and I see a group of fraternity guys in the gate just laughing at me hysterically. So it must have looked very uncoordinated and bad. And I was I was a little sore, but not otherwise hurt except for my pride. But in my small group later that night after I got home, our friends were sitting around, and I was actually going through the thought experiment: who is to blame for the blueberry? Right? I mean, somebody was negligent with their blueberry, and because of that negligence, I could have been really hurt, and there's no way in the world to know who's the cause of that. So what do you do with that remainder of some human force? And sometimes it's not, maybe it's a wildfire or a hurricane or something else. Something has happened in the world that hurts you, and there's nowhere to go with it to get justice or understanding or finality. So you can, for your own sake and for the sake of the world, choose forgiveness and grace and moving forward, or you can be stuck in this sense of, I've been wronged and this is unfair and the world owes me something, but you're never going to be able to cash in that debt in the world. So on a practical level, I think it's really useful and freeing to think about these ideas like forgiveness, and then to have a narrative that connects them to a broader set of resources, which is why I think the gospel and the tradition that the church has long had about the power of forgiveness is so important to continue to share with a broader world, because we now have parts of the world that say not only I'm not going to forgive, but your forgiveness is itself wrong and bad. So if forgiveness becomes no longer a moral good, but a moral bad, then we're in even deeper trouble. So I think, it's one thing to talk about speaking truth in the world, that's important, but speaking forgiveness in the world and speaking grace and mercy in the world, which are going to be increasingly countercultural to some people, is going to be important for Christians to model.
Mm-hmm. And drawing on that tradition, Archbishop Tutu, I believe the title of one of his books, No Future Without Forgiveness, resonates with what you're saying. I think he had sort of outpaced many of us in terms of this thinking. I'm going to stop talking just a second, but it was interesting how the last chapter of the book deals with the concept of friendship. You talk about how real friendship depends on a balance of both shallow and deep experiences, so deep conversations, intimate conversations, but also playing golf or doing something a little bit more superficial. I wonder why you chose to end the book on friendship. Is it a key that helps to unlock some of the other concepts, or an alternative to the divisions and fractures we see running rampant in society, or perhaps a sign of hope? What was the thinking behind that?
Yeah, so the way I structure each chapter is with a question, not a statement. And so the last question is, can we be friends? And I kind of mean it open-endedly. Maybe the answer is no. And certainly in some of our hardest relationships across difference, friendship is not going to be the plausible goal. Maybe it's just a little more mutual understanding. But I also want to hold out the possibility of real friendship across difference. And I talk about a few examples in the book in my own life. Because when you discover, I think when you know who you are, and when you are creative and generous with what you have in common, then you can really set the conditions for an authentic friendship, which, as you point out, I think at least in my life, I need a mix of both shallow and deep. So I've got some friends, especially some work colleagues, who they're very smart people. We talk ideas all the time. They're good colleagues, but we're not really friends because it's all ideas all the time. And then I've got some other neighborhood folks I know who it's just, sports or whatever, and it's great, but they're not really friends either because we never go deep. But it's that friendship that blends the two, where there's something really special that happens. And I think that can happen also in relationships across difference, because it also then, I think, entails a kind of vulnerability. And vulnerability is probably, I don't think I really talk too much about that word expressly in this book, but it's a little under the hood. Mm-hmm. That in order to understand differently, in order to have genuine questions of curiosity, in order to take risks in relationships, it's going to entail a kind of vulnerability. And the thing about vulnerability is you might get hurt, mm-hmm. right? You might get rejected. You might have someone not reciprocate. You might feel misunderstood. And that's also, I think, as Christians, something that we are not alone in having experienced that in our faith.
Mm-hmm. With all the divisions we see around us and the effort that we know deep down is involved in forming and reforming habits and bad habits and practices, this can seem a bit discouraging. It seems like we're never going to get there. Where do you see signs of hope?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I'm going to talk about sort of a worldly small h hope and then a gospel hope. And so, I mean, I think to start with the Christian story, I think the most hopeful thing about all of this is the reminder that we're part of this very long story that is unfolding over thousands of generations, and that we're just all bit players in this. And we've been given this opportunity to have a very small role. And for most of us, the seeds we plant, maybe they come to fruition 5 generations after our grandkids die. And that's okay, because our ultimate hope is not in what we do or what we build, but in what is to come and what has already happened. And that it kind of means the pressure's off. That's an amazing and freeing recognition of what reality is, and not just reality for our own personal faith lives in church, but reality for the entire created order. That's incredible. That's big H hope. Now, little h hope in this era of social media and AI and polarization and fracture and distrust in institutions and the collapse of journalism and all of that, no small things. But I do think I am deeply encouraged when I do a lot of sort of travel and speaking at the local level. When people talk about local institutions, you move from kind of the abstract vitriol to people who actually have to get things done together. And I also think local politics can be part of this too. You can't not fix the road, right? So the possibilities that local collaborations in politics offer as a way of practically doing real bridge building work, but also modeling it, especially for younger generations. I think that's where we've got to put our time and efforts. Congress is not going to show us the way, right? And our national politics and our online interactions are not going to do it. So we can double down on our investments in local institutions and stop worrying about, a program that's going to be snazzy or a one-year ROI, but think, how do we invest in formation and institution building over time so that the 20-somethings now can see and experience a different kind of engagement. And then, because I actually think, I spend my time with students, and the huge upside of students is they've got all of this passion and energy, and they care deeply about things that matter. The downside is often that they don't actually have the skills or strategy to solve some of those problems. And so how do you help guide a younger, very energetic and very eager younger generation to understand what strategy and institutions and culture change looks like, and work with them toward that, because they're going to have to be the ones to figure this out for the rest of us. Mm-hmm. And I am encouraged by a lot of what I see, but it's going to take time. And so I'm most encouraged, little h hope, when I see people who get that and see, for Christians, they're playing a very long game, and in other institutions, they're recognizing we're not going to solve this by next semester or by the next election cycle. This is about, how do we build now to change things in 10 years or in 15 years? And there are a lot of people who are thinking about those questions.
Wonderful. Well, I'd like to open it up for questions from the audience. So who has a question, either on content from the book, which I tried to tease out a little bit, or just more generally about anything that I'll just leave it wide open, right?
Yeah,
Sure. I promised you we were going to have a lot of questions, so I know there's going to be at least one. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. No one's concerned about, I was going to say, no one's concerned about anything right now? No issues?
I was interested in the description of the title, and you're talking about learning to disagree. And simply, I wanted to know why you didn't use the gerund in disagreeing.
So give me the full revised title.
Yeah, you said you're learning. It's a journey,
Yep.
And it seemed like disagree was finite, when in fact disagree could continue. And so you're learning to continue to disagree or resolve continuing disagreements.
But that wouldn't be a very catchy title, would it?
Well, I'm just saying, possibly, but learning about disagreeing, I don't know.
Yeah, no, okay, I see the point now. Yeah, I think that's probably right, and maybe implicit in what I am trying to say is there will be instances where you actually find a shared consensus. Oh, this is actually, I'm glad you at least got me thinking in this direction, because for a lot of the super hot button policy issues in our country today, if you poll most Americans, there's actually incredible consensus in sort of a range of possibilities. It's the national political parties and increasingly pockets of journalism who are incentivized to say it's all or nothing, burn it down, winner take all, and the extremes. But they're actually, people are complicated and have nuanced views about lots of things. And so I think in some cases, you're actually going to discover that you're not sort of in perpetual disagreement. And other times you'll find, oh, actually this is kind of zero sum, and there's only one winner here, which means there's going to be one loser. So I tell in the book the story of, I'm somebody who has significant allergies, and I don't want to understate the point here. So when I was tested as an adult for environmental allergens, cats and dogs and trees and that sort of thing, I was tested for 61 of them, and I was allergic to 57. So I am allergic to everything, and my allergist said the medically appropriate response here is to put you in a bubble, but we can't do that. So we're going to give you lots of shots and pills. But what all this is building toward is when I am on an airplane sitting next to the pet dog or the pet cat, and no offense to any of you who might do this, but that is not a good experience for me. And I raise the point to say the airlines have a zero-sum choice to make. There's going to be a winner and a loser. Either you get to take your pet with you, and I have a suboptimal flight, or I get to be allergy-free, and you have a suboptimal flight. And so you can't have half a dog, right? And you can't have me only a little allergic. So we've got these issues in our society, whether it's pets on airplanes or deep policy disputes, where there are going to be answers that recognize winners and losers. And all of us in our complicated political lives are going to experience wins and losses over the course of our lives. So what do you do when you lose? Then you try to come up with a better argument and try to persuade more people of why your position should prevail. And if you win, then you recognize that people around you think differently, and you don't gloat, and you don't think that you're invincible. And that's how you do the experiment that we call democracy, because there's no other way in a world that's so divided and sees things so differently.
I think the point that you raised about filling you up with positive feeling first is important. I think you can fill yourself up with the music here tonight. You can fill yourself up with all sorts of meditation, yoga, prayer, and I think that's very valuable, because then you said go forward with low expectations. And I think when you have students, and I've met people that want to change the world, you just have to kind of bite your tongue, and maybe they can create a ripple which goes out. But I think some people have these unrealistic expectations.
Yeah, they do. And I think also, I mean, we were talking earlier about just being teachers. Some of us are all teachers, and when you teach, sometimes it's going to be a very, very delayed gratification. And so and this is true of parenting and lots of other parts of life, where you're really having to think long term. And I'll have instances where I'll sometimes have students 4 or 5 years out of school write to me and say, oh, you know what, that thing you said, I finally get it, and thanks for saying it. But if I'm looking for some sort of instant feedback, it's not going to happen, and it's going to be very discouraging. So to have those modest goals and to say, but then I think alongside that to recognize we're all still works in progress. And you mentioned the story of my student who really kind of at the end of the of our time together really brought it together and introduced some nuance into her own thinking. And I as I tell that story, I'd kind of lost the perspective that we're all works in progress and change is possible. And if you give up on people, it's not going to go well. But then I think to your point, then to balance that with a kind of modest expectations. People seldom change overnight and in dramatic ways.
Going to give it a little different twist. I'm curious, have you written other books? What made you choose this topic for an entire book? And did you self-publish or did you have an agent?
Yeah, so this is my fourth book. They've all been a little different. My core, I think, expertise is as an academic lawyer, and so I have typically published with academic presses. The book that I did with Tim Keller, who had his own agent, and it was a very different kind of writing and publishing. And then for this book in particular, because I had a sense of what I wanted to do, I had never before had my own agent, and I thought this book is going to need an agent. So it took me a year and a half to find an agent. And I'll say, I'm a tenured professor. I'd already written 3 books, and I spent a year and a half getting rejected by agent inquiries before the one finally responded, and her response ended up being exactly the right one that shepherded this book in some very helpful ways. But it was not without a lot of discouragement. I don't want to give any kind of false sense that this is easier. It just happens. I think it's, you throw out a lot of efforts and hope that one lands.
I don't like the word disagree. It puts one against the other to reach an agreement, and I'm not even sure agreement is what you should be looking for. It should be understanding. And so instead of disagreeing and then agreeing, it should be, you know what, I look at it differently. Explain to me or whatever. And so I think you should be looking for understanding rather than agreement. And I'd just like to hear what you have to say about that.
No, I mean, I like the point. I do think part of what I'm talking about is understanding. I'm certainly not advocating for agreement. The title is not Achieving Consensus, because that's not going to happen. And I think maybe, I mean, a lot of the concepts I talk about in the book are about understanding. That's sort of the part of the point of empathy. I think I chose disagree in the title to recognize the fact and the depth of our differences that are not going away. So think about our society today. People around us disagree about questions like, what is a human being? What counts as human flourishing? What is the purpose of our country? Those are massively important questions, and we are fundamentally divided about them, and we're not going to come to agreement. And so in that sense, I think I went with something like disagree rather than understanding, to try to nod to the fact that we will perpetually be, right, short of Christ coming back, we will perpetually be in a society with very deep differences and disagreements over things that matter, and that's what we have to learn to do. I like the goal of understanding. I mean, if I were at a point in my life where I could fully understand the other side and all of those hard issues, I would sleep a lot easier at night, I think.
I have a question for you. Earlier in my career, I was a lawyer for a number of years, and it seemed to me that in the 70s, 80s, 90s, there was generally more an ability to compromise. People were willing to compromise, not only in politics, but in business and the law disputes. For some reason, that seems to have disappeared. And I wondered if you had any thoughts as to how that happened, because it's very curious to me at this point that people, regardless of what issues involved or what side you're on, there's a total unwillingness to compromise and get something done.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right descriptively in terms of what's happened, and it's come at great cost to our social and democratic fabric. So two examples that come to mind as you're talking, I mean, one, well, both related to law and policy making, but the way in which the federal system now handles confirmation hearings for federal judicial nominations, that is not about compromise. It is about ideology and counting the votes. And we are seeing on both sides of the aisle increasingly judicial nominees and candidates who are not sort of, like a Sandra Day O'Connor, let's figure it out, Western pragmatism, whatever you want to call it. That's not the vibe anymore on either side of the aisle. And then that gets baked into not only our courts, but how they model that behavior for law students and lots of other people. That's a change. The bigger one to me is what we see in Congress. I mean, if there's legislative policy making seems to me almost definitionally to have to require compromise, where no side gets what they want and everyone walks away a little unhappy, but also glad we got something done. And the more that the system has tended toward these very destructive primaries and the money and the incentives behind the primary system that increasingly encourages more extreme partisan ideological candidates who are not going to compromise, the two things happen. The culture changes, and also nothing gets done. Right? And then a corollary of that is a power grab from the executive branch, which again, believe what you want to believe about the various parties and candidates, but the collective power concentration in the executive branch, which is really a consequence of the last 5 or 6 administrations, is not good for our country. And it's not. We're actually we saw this week, right? The executive orders coming out, and the Biden administration did a similar, though less drastic thing. Those are not about compromise. They're about sort of fiat about what you want done without the work of compromise. And I think this is not a good way to run a country, because it's going to flip in 4 years and you're going to have all these undone, and we're not actually making any progress on any policy issues because we've lost the ability to compromise here. And this then is, I think, tied to what we were talking about earlier, the importance of building trust and relationships, which is not happening in a lot of these institutions.
I'm just wondering whether the rhetoric based on the Christian faith is an effective argument anymore, or whether many people are turned off by our reference to a proposition that would have been self-evident 30 years ago or 50 years ago. Are we now limited to talking in terms that don't mention a transcendent idea, or are we still able, recognizing we're motivated by Christian values, are we limited in talking about those motivations just by the nature of the world, and what does that do to our ability to reach a consensus or to reach any kind of an understanding?
Yeah, so I've got lots of thoughts on that question. I think context matters, so recognizing the context we're in and what faithfulness looks like in a given context. So a couple of things that have changed. One is just basic background cultural literacy about what Christianity is. 50 years ago, you could walk down Fifth Avenue and assume that everybody knew what the 4 Gospels were. Or you could at least name them, right? And you could do a basic sort of story about the basics of Christianity. I mean, that's gone now, just in terms of cultural literacy. So you can't assume a background foundation of what you mean by Christian. And then in place of that, and this is kind of where you're hinting, a lot of the most visible examples and models of people who are claiming the name of Christ and the tradition of Christianity look pretty bad. So when you bring those two together, your average person who's never heard of Christianity is not going to come in with some sort of neutral tell me about what you believe, right? They're going to have an image in their mind or an idea that might not be very good. And also, those images and ideas are going to be reinforced by massively successful communications networks and billions of dollars that will ensure that for the rest of all of our lifetimes, that brand of Christianity will be foregrounded for a lot of people. So then what do you do given that cultural and contextual reality? Well, I think it's to start with at least a recognition that you can't presume that walking down the street in a collar is going to make people respectful of you, right? They may actually have a very different response. But then with that, to be open to conversations and invitations. And so the way I've been trying to think about this more broadly is, Christians are called to live faithful in their context, but also what does it mean to live not just faithfully, but neighborly in a world that you don't control? And it's that last part, starting with the premise that we don't control the world, which I think is part of the key that unlocks this whole thing for us. It doesn't mean you never talk about your faith. It doesn't mean that your Christian resources are always going to be detrimental. We've got plenty of historical examples where people spoke boldly about the power of Jesus in ways that transform societies. But I think it means going back to the context in which the New Testament writers understood what they were writing, which was to a group that was not in control and to a group that had to be creative and curious and demonstrative of love and that sort of thing. And if we can shift toward that mindset, it doesn't mean hide the Christianity, but it means starting with the contextual reality that people aren't going to understand necessarily or love what you represent.
Well, that is not only hopeful, but it gives us something to work on. It gives us something to do. I knew once I get them started, they would have tons of questions, but we are just about out of time, and I want to be mindful of your time. So a big thank you to Dr. Inazu for being with us today. Feel free to show him your face.
Yes, great, thanks. Thanks for being here.
Thank you all for coming out as well. Next week we will be having another Thursday night event. 5:30 it'll be Celtic Evening Prayer on the Labyrinth, and then dinner. And unfortunately, Dr. Inazu will not be with us, but we'll do something else fun. So do come out for that. Let's close with a word of prayer. O God, the Father of all, whose Son commanded us to love our enemies, lead them and us from prejudice to truth. Deliver them and us from hatred, cruelty, and revenge. And in your good time, enable us all to stand reconciled before you through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.